erotic phenomenon as opposed to this power or psychological.
Well, there are those who would have us believe that that is the case in America. Here, for instance, is an article written by a law professor in Washington, D.C., who was general counsel to the Metropolitan Police Department. This article was written in 1981. He says, if the boys are victims, it is largely in the technical sense. It is more accurate to characterize them as entrepreneurs who, by and large, understand their own motivations. They do it for money, for drugs, for pleasure, and perhaps for some as a crude gambit for emotional sustenance. But unlike teenage girl prostitutes, they do not act out of fear. There is no coerced recruitment, no whippings, no incarcerations in their rooms, and no sweet-talking pimps with Cadillacs. That's not what I have found.
So you think that's false, that Washington police chief?
I think it's false, and I think it's a deliberate falsehood.
Well, let's talk about, we haven't talked about the proliferation in the United States of this. We've talked about a few individual cases. How widespread is it, and what are the numbers we're talking about?
Well, we know this, for instance. This is a standard. 500,000 kids run away or are thrown out of homes every year in the United States, and the majority of them are boys. Another thing that the President's Commission on Obscenity found, this is the commission that Richard Nixon repudiated, it mentioned in passing that child pornography was a phenomenon of the abuse of children, and then went on to say that for every female prostitute of any age in the United States, there are 9 boys underage who are prostitutes. That is a finding which is debatable and is a speculation, but it went unnoticed. I think, though, that if you get in a car and prowl the streets of the capitals of this practice, Houston, New Orleans, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and to a much lesser extent, Austin, our state capital, and Washington, the nation's capital, you'll find that boys are the ones hustling more than the women.
Mark, some of the research that you did in Austin here that started off your involvement in this issue indicated that there was a possible ring of homosexual boys in Austin. Could you tell some of the facts on this case?
Well, my interest in this whole issue originated when, as a reporter for the Daily Texan, we heard through the grapevine that a pharmacist here in town had been busted. And I don't remember the original charge. I'm not sure if it was
abuse of a boy in a home.
I guess it was abuse of a, that's right, abuse of a boy in a halfway house. Well, the thing that interested us about the case was that the police had later found in his home a file, an index file, of anywhere from 200 to 500 names of young boys in the around the Travis County area and counties accompanying Travis County. And it had their names, phone numbers, parents' names, in many cases, sexual statistics on the personnel, height, age, weight, and in some cases preferences. And that sounded like an astounding thing to us, that there should be somebody traveling around, and what he did was he would hang out at high schools and offer the drugs that he had available, as he was a pharmacist, in exchange for sexual favors. Well, we followed that up, and somewhere down the line of judicial scrutiny, the evidence was lost, or disappeared, or was unable to be retracted, and it complicates from there. But that's how we got.
Well, Anderson, his name was Anderson, Robert Anderson. He was found guilty of one charge and sentenced to 2 years in prison. And then he skipped. He was still not incarcerated. He skipped, and he's never been found again.
Was there any indication that he was involved with other men who were participating in these favors? In other words, what would the point of him keeping these cards be, unless there was some sort of business or organization?
He was an agent, and he had Quantities of drugs, Mark didn't mention that he listed next to the name of each boy that boy's personal drug preference.
Yeah.
And he also had a very large quantity of muscle relaxants to administer to boys to make sex easier for the men.
Not only that, but there was also the names of several well-known business men in the Texas community that, for obvious reasons, were contacts.
Okay, what about, you talked about Boy Scout groups and boys' homes. What about these?
Well, a boys' home is an ideal place if you want to get in on an operation and get hold of some vulnerable kids. It's an ideal place to do it. In San Antonio this August, 2 men who were supposed to be Catholic priests were arrested for sodomizing 50 boys, ages 3.5 to 14, that year, and they had had several hundred boys in the past 3 years. They're having sex with the boys on a regular basis. That was why they established the home, to get at little boys. In Dallas, a place was closed down the year before. In Houston, Jimmy was in a home in Houston for a while, and he was raped by his caretaker. That place was closed down. In Houston, there are only 42 beds available in all the homes for boys in the whole city, and one of the homes that's still open was previously investigated, and arrests were made because of attacks on the boys. It's very common. It's very hard to trust any place that presents itself as a home for boys. And one of the tragedies of that is when somebody opens one that is clean, like Covenant House in New York City, operated by Father Bruce Ritter, the first thing that happens is there's a smear campaign against it, and everybody says it's dirty too. So if there's a clean one, it gets a bad name. The object is that to make it impossible to tell the good ones from the bad ones.
I guess the Boy Scout people have this problem too, don't
Yes, we've mentioned a couple of Boy Scout rings. That doesn't mean that the Boy Scouts
Right.
are an organized group to feed pederasts.
What about judges and police?
Judges and police are in high-pressured
And they're
professions
involved
too.
in some of these too, then?
To my knowledge, the police are involved less as practitioners of this than the other stressful professions, by far.
We mentioned...
I should have mentioned the clergy. With all regret, the clergy is highly susceptible to this. Real priests, not just bogus priests like those in San Antonio.
You mentioned some of the worst phenomena here, these mass murders in Houston and in Chicago. Does this connect with Atlanta in any way? There's been, as you know, mass murders of all these black children in Atlanta. And as I recall, the FBI, when they initially got in the case, after they made this a federal case, Reagan, or I guess it was Bush, went down there, the FBI came out with a report that indicated that there may be sex abuse of some sort in the death of these children. Then it seemed to be pretty much dropped after an initial play in the media. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes. The first indications that leaked out that maybe the kids who were victimized in Atlanta, murdered, were actually boy prostitutes who went to the people in the cars to make a contact, came out in February. And then national or cable news network and ABC News tried to mention this as a possibility. It's a very delicate thing. It's almost an insult and affront to the black community to say the angels of Atlanta were really prostitutes, unless you believe, as I do, and unlike that law professor I quoted, unless you believe they're victims. They're not responsible for what is happening. They are being used and abused. But the public reaction was chilly, so the networks dropped it. They revived it in April and dropped it again. I have headlines here, quotations from news broadcasts about the boys possibly being hustlers, and that the fellow who has been arrested and indicted being a photographer procurer. Among the mothers of the first 10 kids, those women who went public and talked about their predicament, is one who said to the wire services in an interview, I'm afraid my son was involved in prostitution. I'm afraid that that's what got him killed. I'm afraid it's the link to the whole series of murders, and no newspaper in America printed the wire service copy.
Isn't part of this whole phenomenon dealt with a business of pornography, child pornography,
Oh,
where pictures
yes.
are taken of these acts, films are made, and this Wayne Williams, we know is a
Yeah,
photographer, and we know he has training in electronics. He'd done radio work, he'd done recording work, so might he be involved in a film organization, and indeed possibly even a snuff organization? There's been some evidence about snuff films where people are literally killed on film, and that these are distributed, the films. So is there some possibility that that might be involved?
I think it's possible, and I think
phenomenon.
it's likely. We're talking about an ongoing case, and I think we have to be very careful about what we say. In Houston, I have seen myself big vans that don't have cabs on them. And I've seen young kids go into the van and not emerge for an hour or an hour and a half. And sometimes with the door open, I've seen photographic equipment inside. A raid was made on a mansion in Houston, although the newspapers in Houston referred to it as a flat. It was a mansion. Inside that mansion was more photographic equipment than KLRN, KLRU possesses, and that's one of the biggest stations in the Southwest. Bigger than Channel 13 in Houston possesses. Channel 13 played up the raid, but the news media besides Channel 13 didn't. It was as if 5 guys in a little studio were taking candid camera shots of kids. They were producing books in there. There was also an arrest in Houston in 1981 of a man who sold 20 different films, child pornography films, to somebody from Boston. Now, he was committing several federal crimes in doing that.
Right.
And among those films, although the newspapers would not print the information, among those films was that of an infant being sexually used by men, and a film in which somebody appears to have been murdered. That person hasn't gone to jail yet.
What about the bookstores and the the places where they show movies and stuff like this? Here in town, for instance.
I think that
how much,
you don't find much evidence of this sort of thing in the bookstores, because it's the people who are trading and dealing with this kind of thing. It's a very clandestine operation, and having gone through an investigation myself, I know how absolutely impossible it is to trail this stuff. I mean, you're dealing with people who are not stupid. You know, they are in levels of power because they're intelligent people, by and large, and they cover their tracks, and they're not about to be dealing with them through the bookstores. I think maybe 5 years ago you could find that sort of thing, but now I think it's been pretty much cleaned up. Tom may have more.
Well, I went into a bookstore in Austin 2 years ago in daylight, and my experience is the difference between the operation in daytime and nighttime is the difference between night and day. Yet, in daylight, I first bought a magazine that had pictures of people of borderline age. They could have been 18, they could have been 17, and 17 is legal. And then I had the names of illegal publications. I first asked for a register that listed boys by description. It was a catalog, the order of boy. I asked for that.
In a bookstore?
Yeah.
You're in Austin?
Yeah.
Or,
It's a crime to print that, to reproduce it, to distribute it, to buy it, to possess it. I broke the law by saying, I want that, and the guy reached under the counter and handed it to me. Then I said, what about this? And he handed me that, and I said, what about this one? And he handed me one more. And I walked out of there with a lot of illegal goods. That was in the daytime. I understand that as of now, 1981, the same bookstores don't let somebody they don't know do that sort of thing, even at night. But I've been in places in Houston within the last several months. One in particular I can describe to you had 40 cubicles where supposedly men go in and put in quarters to watch dirty movies. And outside every cubicle was a little boy. I was approached both by little boys, as if I were a man who might want a boy, and I was approached by older men who, in the dark, thought I looked young. That was on a weeknight, not on Friday or Saturday. in Houston?
When I started following up some films that we heard were circulating in the Houston area, I called an old friend of mine while I was investigating another case involved in this, because we heard that it had been viewed by